Hello, my name is Karaan, and my dissertation examines the effect of oil dependence on banking sector development in the MENA economies since 1970. The motivation comes from a simple but important observation. Oil has shaped economic structures across the region for decades, yet we know far less about how it has shaped financial sector development. Banking systems are central to economic diversification, private investment, and long run growth. But in economies where the state derives a large share of income from oil rents, the incentives and structure of financial intermediation may look very different. So, my core research question is: does oil dependence promote or hinder banking sector development over the long run? To explore this, I analyzed panel data for major MENA oil exporters from 1970 onward, and for the purpose of this presentation, compare the trajectories to a non MENA oil exporter. To understand oil dependence, we first need to understand oil price volatility. This figure shows the real WTI oil price index since 1970. What stands out immediately is the repeated pattern of large price shocks in the 1970s, mid 1980s, early 1990s, the 2008 global financial crisis, and more recently during the COVID-19 period. These are not small fluctuations, they are major macroeconomic shocks. For oil exporting economies, oil price movements translate directly into fiscal revenues, public spending capacity, and liquidity conditions. This volatility creates a key mechanism in my study. If oil revenues drive government spending and domestic liquidity, then banking sector development may rise during booms and contract during busts. So, the first building block of my argument is that oil dependent economies face repeated external fiscal shocks driven by global commodity prices. The next figure shows oil rents as a percentage of GDP for major MENA exporters, including Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE, compared with Norway as a non MENA oil exporter. Oil rents are essentially the profits gained from oil production. The contrast is striking. For many MENA economies, oil rents frequently account for between 20 and 40% of GDP, and in some periods exceed 60%. This indicates a high level of structural dependence on oil revenues. Norway, by contrast, maintains significantly lower oil rents as a share of GDP, reflecting stronger diversification and institutional management of resource wealth. The key implication is that MENA economies are not simply oil producers, they are structurally oil dependent. This dependence makes fiscal policy, liquidity conditions, and state involvement in the economy highly sensitive to oil price cycles. This final figure shows private credit by banks as a percentage of GDP, my main measure of banking sector development. This refers to financial resources provided to the private sector by banks. We observe gradual upward trends across most countries, but with clear volatility and divergence. Norway again follows a smoother and more sustained financial deepening trajectory. This raises an important question. If oil generates liquidity and fiscal surpluses, we might expect it to promote banking development. But if oil revenues reduce the need for private taxation and weaken institutions, oil dependence could instead crowd out genuine financial deepening. The question then becomes: how does this structural dependence shape financial development? This project is motivated by both policy and academic relevance. From a policy perspective, oil exporting economies across MENA are actively pursuing diversification strategies. For example, through long term development plans such as Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030. Financial systems are central to this process. A well developed banking sector supports private investment, entrepreneurship, and non oil sector growth. However, in economies where the state relies heavily on oil rents, the structure and incentives within the financial system may differ from more diversified economies. Academically, this connects to the broader resource curse debate. A large portion of literature argues that natural resource rents can distort incentives, weaken institutions, and hinder long run development. Yet, the transmission mechanisms remain debated. One possible channel is through the financial system. My contribution sits at the intersection of four strands of literature. First, the theory and resource curse literature, which examines how natural resource rents affect economic development. Second, research on oil price transmission channels, particularly through fiscal policy and macroeconomic volatility. Third, the financial development literature, which highlights the importance of banking depth for growth and diversification. and fourth, MENA-specific empirical studies. While these literatures exist separately, there is limited long-run evidence directly linking oil dependence to banking sector development in MENA economies. This dissertation brings these strands together using panel data from 1970 to 2021, focusing explicitly on the finance-oil relationship. The literature can broadly be grouped into four themes. The resource curse literature, including work by Madhavi, Karl, and Ross, argues that resource rents can distort political and economic incentives, potentially weakening long-run development outcomes. A second strand examines oil price transmission mechanisms. Studies such as Arezki and Bruckner show that oil shocks affect fiscal policy and volatility. Third, the financial development literature, including Levine, Beck, and others, emphasizes that financial intermediation is central to growth and structural transformation. Finally, MENA-specific evidence suggests that these economies exhibit oil-driven structures, but there is a limited focus on how oil dependence shapes financial development. The key gap, therefore, is the lack of an extended panel evidence examining this relationship in the MENA economies up to recent years. To examine this relationship, I construct a panel dataset for major MENA oil exporters covering the period from 1970 to 2021. Oil dependence is measured using oil rents as a percentage of GDP, a commonly used proxy in the resource literature. Banking sector development is measured using private credit by banks as a percentage of GDP, which captures financial depth and intermediation. I also include standard macroeconomic controls such as GDP per capita and GDP growth. The empirical strategy uses panel regression techniques with country and time fixed effects. This approach allows me to control for unobserved country-specific characteristics and global shocks, while focusing on within-country variation over time. In other words, I am identifying whether changes in oil dependence within a country are associated with changes in banking sector development. In terms of progress, I have constructed a balanced panel dataset covering 10 MENA economies from 1970 to 2021. This dataset includes oil rents, private credit by banks, and other macroeconomic controls. This data has already been cleaned, merged, and structured for panel estimation. I've estimated a baseline fixed effects model with both country and year fixed effects, allowing me to isolate within country variation over time. And to ensure a robust inference, standard errors are clustered at the country level. The preliminary findings suggest a negative relationship between oil dependence and banking sector development. Specifically, the coefficient on oil rents is negative at approximately minus 0.3. This implies that a 1 percentage point increase in oil rents as a share of GDP is associated with a 0.73% reduction in private credit by banks as a share of GDP. This result is statistically significant at conventional levels, with a p-value of 0.062. Importantly, this relationship holds after controlling for income levels, growth, and unobserved country and time effects. The within R-squared of 0.45 suggests that the model explains a substantial share of the variation in banking sector development within countries over time. There are several next steps to strengthen the analysis. First, I will conduct additional robustness checks, including adding inflation as a control variable, testing alternative indicators of financial development, and incorporating lagged oil rents to account for dynamic effects. Second, I plan to explore sample extensions, including expanding MENA coverage where data permits and conducting subsample analysis comparing exporters and non-exporters. Finally, the analysis phase will focus on interpreting the economic magnitude of the results, linking the findings back to the theoretical literature, particularly Beck and Polheke, and discussing the limitations such as potential endogeneity concerns. These steps will help strengthen both the credibility and contribution of this dissertation. To conclude, we can revisit the research question asking whether oil dependence affects banking sector development in the MENA economy since 1970. The preliminary evidence suggests a negative and economically meaningful relationship between oil rents and financial deepening. The results are consistent with resource curse mechanisms operating through fiscal dominance. In oil-dependent economies, large state revenues may weaken incentives for private financial intermediation. Overall, this project contributes to understanding one potential transmission channel of the resource curse through the banking sector. Thank you for listening.